okay, we'll kind of summarize that as almost like I'm not saying we have to rebuild the whole industry. We're still producing 100 million barrels a day, but if you look at the future 10 years, we're not set up to meet the 10-year demand. And that has been caused for reasons that we've discussed. Okay, kind of second pillar that's maybe working against the oil industry. And I think that the overall theme here is when the average American hears, well, gas prices are high, and then they're hearing out of the White House, we'll drill more. Even if you could, we're not talking about days that things happen. We're talking about years, if not a decade, for full things to kind of take shape. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Okay, so number 2 would be kind of this ESG movement. And then we can kind of loop that into governmental action where, at least right now in our country, but also a lot of countries in the world, the top leaders of the world are maybe not paying attention. I don't know what they're doing, but they're basically saying like, we hate oil and gas, even though we need it more than ever. So let's kind of start with number 2. Like, how is the ESG institutionals pulling out? We believe in clean energy, not in dirty oil. What, from a numeric standpoint, capital coming in, but other factors, like how is that impacting the industry?
Yeah, so I think the easy thing is labor. When you have the president of the United States and you have equivalent world leaders and you have influential people, whether they're actors or professors or whatever, when you have them saying that the oil and gas industry is 1, evil, and 2, going away, you scare away the people that you need in order to keep production flowing for long enough for any sort of energy transition to be able to happen. And I mean, there are some like math problems with what people represent from an energy transition perspective, where you look at countries like Norway, where they've shifted heavily towards electric vehicles, and yet their oil consumption isn't down. And so even if there were a large energy transition from a vehicle perspective, which is sort of the threat that's presented for oil and why oil supposedly is going away over the next 20 years, even if there were such a transition, it wouldn't mean that oil is going away. And there's a lot of evidence for that, including countries that have been trying it and are seeing that it doesn't make oil go away. So, and then there's various uses for oil outside of gasoline, but it's less about the specific uses and more about it being tried. It's sort of like socialism, like, and in many cases, it's sort of connected in terms of this sort of like centralized control, what's yours is mine sort of mentality. I mean, it gets really sort of like bucketed in, and where this stuff is tried, in many cases, it's sort of tried by parties that are interested in sort of collectivizing ownership and so on. And so when you have that impetus with the sort of narrative fighting the science and fighting the engineering and physics, you end up with not having the people. Like there's one, I read this the other day, there's one petroleum engineering student at the University of Calgary. And that's like, I mean, there used to be, I think, like 100 a year or something that would graduate. There's one. You need someone to be figuring out where Canadians are putting their 200 something rigs to work to be able to supply enough oil. Even if you think there's going to be half as much oil in 30 years, you still need some, and you're not getting the people, because they're being told it's going away. And the people you get in many cases maybe aren't the people that you'd need, because if you need someone that's brilliant at math and science and that person can read and can listen to their prime minister or president, they might choose to go into some other sort of field instead. And so you end up with multiple aspects to that labor problem. And so I think that's a real issue. And I think there's a lot of deflection, and people are really afraid for various reasons to talk about this. But if you can't be positive about something, you can't expect it to be there when you need it and when you want it in the capacity that you want it and need it. And so negativity just results in more negativity. It doesn't, you kind of need there to be broad acceptance that oil and gas is necessary and is going to be used for a while. And you need there to be substantial economic rewards for everyone involved. And until you have that, you're going to have intermittent, potentially persistent shortages of oil and gas. And so I think that's sort of the interplay of ESG. And there's issues with capital as well. I think the capital issues get solved by enormous profits, and we're still not seeing fund flows into oil and gas funds. You're still seeing sort of net outflows on the private side. Again, a lot of these private funds, from my perspective, embarrass themselves in terms of calling oil going away, getting involved in things like SPACs that have generally been very disappointing. And now we're sort of trying to rebrand again. But again, like that probably shouldn't attract capital, just given the sort of non-clear view and ability to sort of assess cool-headedly with what's happening or going to go on. But even outside of that, there's still this sort of flow of capital, even with oil over 100, out of the industry, private funds that have promised to exit the industry, that historically were sort of opportunists and would come in and deploy a lot of capital when there were cheap stocks or cheap assets to buy. So we haven't even stopped that. It's not that there's not enough inflows. There's still outflows of capital from the industry. So between the labor issue and the capital issue and regulators are tremendously problematic. They're still adding to regulations for the industry. So again, if you want an industry to accomplish something, you deregulate it. If you want like rents to be high, you don't allow people to build new stuff. And if you want rents to be low, you allow people to build a lot of new stuff. Same thing from an oil price perspective. The more you regulate the industry, the more you tax it, the higher the prices are going to be. So again, it's sort of this very disingenuous thing where it's like, you guys are bad, so we're going to regulate you, so your prices are going to go down. And it's like, well, you can't have all of those kind of pick two.
When you say that private funds are promising to get out of oil and gas, who are they promising? Who are they making these promises to? The air? Who do they?
Public and to their LPs. So
why?
I'll pick on Apollo just because this one is kind of interesting. So Apollo's either current or recently former chief investment officer, I'm not sure, one of their founders, was associated with Jeff Epstein. And so it seems that in a sort of way to like continue to attract institutional investment, and they've done extremely well, right? Like great firm, they've done extremely well, great track record across many of their funds over time, great people working there, really hardworking, nothing bad to say about them. But this individual who is a face of the firm, was closely associated with and apparently personally paid Jeff Epstein all this money for all this different stuff. And so around the time that was getting publicized, Apollo came out and said, we will no longer invest in oil and gas. And, I don't think it's hard to connect the dots in between like the same week or a week later, them saying, okay, so they're trying to keep limited partners. Despite a sort of giant scandal and association with a known felon and things that don't pass basic due diligence issues. And so it's hard to not think that other decisions like that aren't being made, not for sort of such extreme reasons, but it's hard to think that there isn't some economic trade-off in terms of assets under management versus optimizing for returns, or even like the right decision, right? I know a number of the people at these different firms, and like they're good people. They understand that oil is necessary. They understand we need to drill more of it, and it's just not their choice. Like if they're not the senior decision maker, and the firm has said, "Hey, we are selling," their job is to sell. It's not to go fund a bunch more wells, even if we're having an issue and actually probably need to drill some more wells.